The Salamanders' role during the Horus Heresy to this day remains only a partly documented affair. What is certain, however, is that the Legion itself, alongside the Iron Hands and the Raven Guard, formed the spearhead of the loyalist assault at the faithful drop site massacre of Isstvan V. Following the revelation of War Master Horus Lupercal's treachery and the near total destruction of the loyalist forces at Isstvan III by the traitorous Sons of Horus, Emperor's Children, World Eaters, and Death Guard, the Emperor ordered a counterstrike as 7 supposedly loyalist legions were dispatched to bring Horus to heel. Yet unbeknownst to the planners, 4 of these reinforcements, those being the Alpha Legion, the Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, and the Word Bearers, had secretly pledged themselves to the ruinous powers and were aligned with Horus, lying in wait for the perfect time to betray their brothers at the most critical and opportune moment. The first wave was led under the supreme command of Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands, which consisted of the Iron Hands, the Raven Guard, and the Salamanders, as they secured the drop site at an enormous cost, demonstrating both discipline and valor in the face of overwhelming odds. At this moment, Horus would feign retreat, and in doing so, he lured Manus into an overextension. Against the direct counsel of both Corvus Corax and Vulkan, Manus pursued the withdrawing traitor forces, only to be confronted by his brother Fulgrim. As the duel of the Primarchs raged, the Raven Guard and the Salamanders withdrew to temporarily regroup, anticipating the advance and aid of the second wave. It was at this critical juncture that the treachery of the second wave was revealed. The Night Lords, Alpha Legion, and Iron Warriors alongside with the Word Bearers struck without warning and cut down loyalists without mercy. Simultaneously, the first wave of traitor legions regrouped, trapping the loyalist forces in a devastating pincer assault. The Iron Hands were all but obliterated as veteran Morlock Terminators fell, and Primarch Ferrus Manus was quickly and unceremoniously beheaded by Fulgrim. The Salamanders and the Raven Guard, though desperate to aid their fallen allies, were forced to break out of the position with only a fraction of their full numbers. Thunderhawk and Stormbird gunships lifted off, carrying survivors, but far fewer than had initially been calculated during the descent to the surface. Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard was also gravely wounded during the scuffle. Vulkan and his salamanders began the painstaking work of rebuilding from here, preserving what remained of their strength and the Legion's spirit, ensuring that the salamanders would rise again from the ashes of betrayal and treachery. To go into further detail, the assault went as follows. Seconds after the first dropship pierced the thick and turbulent cloud layer above the Ulgurl depression, the ground erupted in a symphony of death, as batteries of emplaced guns disgorged torrents upon torrents of fire, cutting through the descending transports with an unimaginable precision. As flak rained down like molten rain, shredding both wings and hulls, as detonating munitions shredded through loyalist forces midair, scattering their deadly contents not only across the sky but across the battlefield proper. Yet amidst this maelstrom, the Loyalists pressed on. When the first wave of Loyalist forces finally struck the planet's surface, more than 40,000 legionaries poured out into the scorched black sand of the world. Of the initial deployment, only 15 Salamanders gunships and 11 drop pods were lost. This was more of a testament to the Salamanders' mastery over up-arming technology than anything else. The assault itself was structured with precision, almost surgical in its intent. The Salamanders struck the left flank, while the Raven Guard went to the right, and Ferrus Manus alongside his massed Morlock Terminator cadre would hold the center. Black sand, cratered and uneven from the bombardment, made the movement uncertain along with unsteady, as waves upon waves of Astartes emerged from the holds of the dropship and the dissipating fire clouds of incoming drop pods. Several faltered, slipping upon the treacherous terrain and being brought low by heavy encamped fire. Even as they securely landed, the enemy tore into them as the ranks advanced. Hundreds of the first legionaries to land fell long before a beachhead was secured or any defensive position established. Bolter fire met bolter fire, in an unending cascade of flame and percussive fire, punctuated by the staccato roar of thousands upon thousands of discharging weapons. Missile volleys whined overhead, leaving stark white contrails in their wake, while earthworks erupted in searing explosions, throwing dirt and armored warriors up into the air. Las bolts streaked across the sky, searing tanks and dreadnoughts alike, only to meet a relentless counterassault. Flamers smoked the skies with choking heat and the stench of incinerated human flesh, as more esoteric weapons pulsed and shrieked. It was a cacophony of utter annihilation, yet it sounded like a symphony of death to the traitors, one which had only begun to sing its first verse. Along the right flank, a green tide of the Salamanders Legion surged forth. Legionaries spilled from their transports, forming into disciplined, purposeful battalions. The black sands obscured beneath their feet as they advanced with both banners and vexillas snapping in the wind, attempting to impose order in this chaotic wave. At the forefront strode Vulkan as a colossal figure armored in emerald wrath, flanked by his elite fire drakes. Behind them, Terminators emerged in two formidable battalions, forming veritable metal spearheads, yet the secondary might of their contemptor dreadnoughts and the recently re-established Saturnine pattern dreadnoughts aided in the Salamander's advance. These towering dreadnoughts, living relics of war, stomped across the battlefield, with graviton guns, autocannons, and a litany of esoteric, harshly remembered weapons, tore defenses apart. However, their advance was slow, yet unending, as attack horns blared and were amplified further still through vox emitters, their discordant notes simulating cries of ancient drakes, magnifying the terror across the enemy ranks. Here the Salamanders moved not as soldiers, but as an unyielding tide of green, each step a drumbeat, a deadly march towards Horus's rebels, as the battlefield became an extension of their will, and the black sands, now swallowed in green, smoke, and fire, waved as the first verse of the Dropsite Massacre played out in terrifying clarity. The loyalists would not know what was to come next. As this was happening, Spartan assault tanks, Predator's Infernuses, and Vindicator tanks disgorged themselves from the Thunderhawk transports, as the Salamander's full armored might poured into the Old Girl Depression. Tracks ground the blackened sand into more fine dust as they advanced, as a veritable rolling bulwark made its way forward, anchoring the drop site. These three spearheads drove directly towards the fortress, squatting atop Urgal's hills, two walls of black and one of green, all converged at the heart of the traitor line. In seconds, the shifting sands vitrified under the searing heat of tens of thousands of bolters, flamers, melta-weapons, and volkite being fired upon the world, as the sand cracked under the pressure due to becoming molten glass. Vulkan, still at the forefront, ordered his Gene sons to seize the ridge, gaining a tactical advantage over their entrenched foes, as shells pranged and ricocheted off his emerald carapace. Yet he pressed forward, the Power Guard straining to keep up pace with their towering Primarch. Behind them, the Pyroclasts advanced methodically, laying down sheets of burning promethium upon both their flanks, as they moved in a rolling tide of flame meant to shepherd the enemy into submission. Even the Terminator armored fire drakes, massive and dauntless, struggled to match the Primarch's pace. Their commander, First Captain Numenon, noted the risk of falling behind, isolated from Vulkan's spearhead. To bolster the assault, the 15th Reconnaissance Company assumed a leading position alongside the Power Guard, nimble enough to maintain the charge where bulkier fire drakes and pyroclasts could not. The outermost trench of the Death Guard's defensive network now loomed ahead, fire blackened and jagged. Hunkered within, the Death Guard Legion, once comrades, now faced the Salamanders as enemies. Trench gunners unleashed a torrent of bolter fire, countering the advancing green tide. Vulkan shrugged aside splintering rounds, which ricocheted off his nearly impervious armor, as he continued pressing forth, unyielding, slaying uncountable numbers of his brother's gene sons. Across the Ogral Depression, the battle raged on, without nary a pause, as company-sized engagements erupted alongside smaller squads and lone duels. Legions locked in mortal combat with no overarching order. Only a singular purpose: annihilate the enemy. While the bulk of the loyalist forces moved to engage Horus's fortress, a few stubborn squads held the breach, crushing any enemy forces that dared approach. As the 15th Company pressed against the retreating Death Guard, a dirty yet suffocating cloud descended from the slopes. A chemical miasma was unleashed, thick and fast. It filled the trench work with a deadly reach that was nigh inevitable. The Death Guard, anticipating the arrival of the Salamanders, had adjusted the respirators in preparation. These were no mere weapons of flesh and steel unleashed upon the legions. It was a slow and agonizing instrument, indiscriminate in its destruction, a leveler of both mortal and transhuman alike. From veteran champions to the lowest conscripts, none could escape its horrific toll. The battlefield became a veritable crucible, where fire, smoke, and ash mixed with the hiss of this toxic gas. Sand crackled beneath the weight of armored titans as bolter fire stitched across the air with a wide spark. As the raw methodical force of Vulkan's Legion continued forward, even with this, shaping the first desperate wave of what would be remembered in Imperial history as the Drop Site Massacre. Now the 15th Reconnaissance Company seemed to suffer grievously under the onslaught of the Death Guard's chemical assault, as more than 100 warriors almost instantly collapsed, choking, coughing up blood, as many had chosen to forego helmets, favoring the freedom needed for their stealth-styled operation. And now they paid the price, as their skin blistered and sloughed off under the virulent acids, with their eyes swelling shut, their organs infected with pus, and the choking clouds of noxious gas causing vast waves of convulsive vomiting. What remained of these Astartes were little more than half-armored carcasses. Dozens of them were then shredded by the resurgent Death Guard forces, exploiting the confusion and hacking alongside shooting through their defenseless, disoriented foes. The numerically superior Death Guard then proceeded to encircle the remnants of the Salamanders, intent on fully annihilating them. However, it was Vulkan who intervened, as he then cut a swath through the overlapping warriors, as First Captain Numenon, alongside the Pyre Guard, soon would move ahead to reinforce him, and a dense chaotic melee erupted. Around them, the battlefield roared in an intense brouhaha, with a symphony of fire, steel, and blood-soaked mist clattering around them. Then a new horror arrived, a ruddy smog carried by a crosswind from the east, which swept across the depression, heralding the advance of the 12th Legion, the World Eaters. Ash from thousands of fires darkened the skies, descending upon the combatants. From the haze emerged the rampagers, clad in ritualized gladiatorial gear, wielding the legendary cadre weapons, which were a grim echo of Angron's enslavement. Only 3 squads, no more than 30 warriors had been unleashed, yet they charged forward with a ferocity of hundreds upon hundreds, as bolter fire and shrapnel did little to deter them. There was something truly unnatural in their frenzy. Even in their earliest incarnations as the Warhounds, the 12th Legion had been feared as some of the fiercest close-quarter combatants, but now reborn under Angron's brutal guidance and the boon of the Butcher's nails, the Legion seemed possessed by rage beyond natural predilection, ignoring pain and grievous wounds. Within the Salamanders' ranks, whispers circulated of the devices implanted in Angron's skull by his captors, and the simulacra that now had inflamed his son's temperament. Yet it was at this very moment that the reality of it set in. Amidst the chaos elsewhere on the slopes, the Salamanders' fire drakes clashed with Angron's personal bodyguard, the Devourers, and despite their greater numbers, they became locked in a stalemate. For the first time, the Lord of the Red Sands came close to his honor guard, in a prelude to the confrontations of the Primarchs that would follow throughout the heresy. Then came the challenge. Angron bellowed in his guttural native tongue, calling out the name of his brother Primarch Vulkan. As the blood smeared and partially obscured by the simmering smoke, the Red Angel advanced. Switching to High Gothic, his voice thundered across the Olgal depression as a sound which echoed as if it were a collapsing city. Vulkan, I name you High Rider. With a motorized power axe roaring in his hands, Angron descended upon his brother, the blade hunting for blood, as he was a herald of unparalleled violence, one which would define the very existence of the tragedy of the Dropsite Massacre, as he tore in and through everything that was ahead of him with a systematic aggression that was unparalleled. Further down the scarred slope, Vulkan tightened his grip on the haft of his immense warhammer, known as Dawnbringer, preparing to meet the challenge issued by his brother Angron. Yet before the Primarchs could collide in direct combat, fate or perhaps treachery intervened. An advancing salvo of traitor guns encampments launched a missile into the sky, only for it to descend violently into the slope between the two demigods. The resulting inferno erupted in a vast firestorm, sweeping outwards in turbulent waves, scorching the lower slopes in the heat of flame. At the epicenter of this destruction, it was absolute chaos. Fire drakes caught in the blast were automatically immolated, as their Terminator armor was reduced to molten metal. Yet Vulkan, wreathed in flames, stepped forward unscathed, impervious to the conflagration that had befallen him. The surviving fire drakes rallied to his side, trudging over their fallen whenever necessary, their resolve unbroken, the very attrition inflicted by the relentlessness of the World Eaters ignored. Vulkan understood that this battle demanded every ounce of their endurance, and he allowed himself a fleeting relief when the distant sounds of the arrival of supposed loyalist reinforcements fell, as hundreds of landers and drop pods crowded the smoke-choked sky. Emblazoned with the sigils of the Alpha Legion, the Iron Warriors, the Word Bearers, and the Night Lords, Vulkan watched impassively as the reinforcements touched down, their legionaries forming ranks alongside the edges of the Olgal depression. At this time, Angron was no longer anywhere to be seen, as the firestorm had forced him back. With the arrival of 4 additional legions, the Lord of the Red Sands had prudently ordered a retreat. Both the Raven Guard and the Salamanders withdrew towards the drop site, ceding the field to the newly arrived loyalist forces. Vulkan, alongside his brother Corvus Corax, attempted to persuade the fiery-tempered Ferrus Manus to do the same. Yet the Gorgon was inconsolable. Scenting the blood in the air, he pressed the attack against the retreating traitors, intending to slay his once favored brother Fulgrim. Unknown to the loyalists, the drop site had been secretly reinforced by 4 traitor legions, those that were designated to form the second wave of the Imperial assault, while Horus's retreating forces, seeming ragged and disorganized, were in fact anything but, as armored columns rumbled steadily down the slopes and the scorched trenches. Legionaries filed in vast, orderly hosts. Company banners still held aloft. The wounded and the fallen, retrieved by their surviving brethren, were carried and dragged in a steadfast movement, as a black and green tide of war receded, leaving behind a disoriented and desolated battlefield. This was an exodus, one that would be met with an unimaginable betrayal. On the northernmost face of the Olgal depression, a new tide of devastation awaited the loyalist forces, poised to sweep away all who stood in their path. Across from the Salamanders' makeshift ledge of drop ships, the Iron Warriors had established their own positions, clad in steel gray and black with yellow chevrons. They presented an intimidating yet grim facade, their landing craft having been welded into barricades, armored bastions of unfeeling, unflinching metal, while great cannons rose from behind them, their barrels aimed skywards. All the while, a line of battle tanks bearing the metallic skull emblems formed a deadly shield at the very forefront, and thousands upon thousands of Iron Warriors stood motionless, almost as if they were automata, their weapons held across their bodies, waiting for their next orders. No legionary of the Salamanders stood idle, yet the Iron Warriors made no response, or hail, or challenge. Only the banners stirred in the wind, whispering a latent threat of their intent. Where Vulkan advanced towards Betrayal, the veritable Lord of Iron, their gazes finally met, as the Lord of Drakes noticed at that very instant that they had been betrayed. More than 10,000 arrayed guns erupted in a treacherous fury. Their weapons, those of supposed allies, cut down the Salamanders' ranks, thinning the loyalists between the hammer of Horus and the anvil of the fortified northern drop site. Rage and the bitter sting of betrayal propelled Vulkan up the slope. The Power Guard labored to keep pace, driven by the Primarch's indomitable will. All the while the battle companies followed, captains roaring as the tide of green warriors surged uphill, determined to punish the sons of Betrayal. The crossfire was merciless as hundreds of salamanders fell in the first seconds of this deceit. Yet their tenacity, one of the many virtues of the Legion, propelled them onwards. Only as the majority crested the first ridge did the full scope of the traitor's treachery reveal itself. A secondary blinding arc of fire streaked across the skies as rockets screamed in parabolic arcs before descending onto the midst of the Salamander's charge. The Iron Warriors' orbital fleet also unleashed tactical nuclear strikes, and the Olgarl Hills were torn asunder. In a titanic explosion, craters gorged the black sands as if created by some mythic beasts having descended upon the world, hurling legionaries into the sky as if their suits of armor were empty. Tanks were flipped and ignited, their metal hulls ripped apart, while those spared the initial blast were shredded in a storm of shrapnel. All the while, super heavy tanks collapsed as if they were mere tin cans. Their crewmen boiled alive as the legionaries were reduced to ash in the furnace of betrayal. Only the far advanced Power Guard, slightly ahead of the main body, avoided the full brunt of the blast, as the secondary nuclear blasts generated a subsequent electromagnetic pulse, severing Vox communications entirely. Tactical cohesion would then evaporate. In a catastrophic strike, the Lord of Iron had decapitated the Salamanders Legion and thrown its convulsing body into chaos. Retreat became the only viable option. Survivors fled the drop site, desperate to board upon any ship. It was not a rout in the conventional sense, as few could stand to watch such overwhelming force, but both Vulkan and Horus Corax would survive. Eyewitness accounts conflict. Some reports state that Vulkan was gravely injured, then dragged aboard a Thunderhawk gunship by 3 Power Guard and returned to Nocturne. But the reality of the Primarch's fate was a far darker affair, and more uncertain than even these harrowing accounts suggest. It seems that against all odds, Vulkan survived, being at the epicenter of the nuclear inferno unleashed by the Iron Warriors' orbital strike, a firestorm that had annihilated hundreds upon hundreds of his gene sons almost instantly. Yet his survival offered no immediate respite, as he was now encircled by numbers of traitor legionaries, drawn from the Night Lords and the Iron Warriors. The Primarch of the Salamanders now stood alone. Though he fought with an unmatched ferocity, and every one of his swings with his mighty weapon tucked down scores of traitors Astartes, every clash against the traitors only delayed the inevitable, and eventually the sheer tide of hostile warriors overcame him as he was struck, stabbed, bludgeoned, and beat into unconsciousness. It was then that Conrad Kurz, the Night Lord's twisted and pathetic Primarch, would come to claim him. As he had always been teetering on the brink of madness, Kurz decided to take possession of Vulkan as one would a prize, intending to revel and self-adulate in the torment that he would do upon his sibling. When Vulkan awoke, he found himself shackled in massive chains aboard the Ghoul Hulk of the Night Lord's Legion, far from the heat of battle, yet plunged into a far crueler war. For months on end, the Night Hunter sought to crush him, body and mind alike, employing every conceivable method of torture. Yet each time he struck, Vulkan's very form regenerated. This was a revelation that would drive Kurz to unending fury, as he believed himself to have been cursed with the gift of foresight, while he was now facing a brother that had been revealed as a perpetual, a being capable of continuous cellular regeneration, effectively being an immortal, much like the Emperor himself. Each attempt on his life, beheading, throat-ripping, improvised tools being inserted into his body in varying degrees, impalement, disembowelment, evisceration, mass Volter fire, even exposure to the vacuums of space and dips in acid. All were rendered futile attempts by this nigh unnatural gift. Every failed execution inflamed Kurtz's obsession further and further still, as the Night Hunter sought to force Vulkan to admit that he was a monster akin to himself, as the pathetic excuse of a Primarch sought validation for his own mistake, rather than accepting that it was he who was wrong. Sorcery too failed, as Davenite sorcerer priests, empowered by the ruinous powers, would attempt to assault his mind with illusionary trails, endless scenarios upon where he failed noble tasks, resulting in the deaths of countless innocents. Yet the Primarch's resolve remained unplacable, unbroken even, as his spirit had been tempered by years upon years of loyalty and hardship. At last, the cowardly Kurz had devised a final challenge, a duel of cunning and endurance, as he offered Vulkan a chance to reclaim his freedom and his prized weapon, the legendary Dawnbringer, but only through a battle within a labyrinth of unfathomable complexity, crafted by Betrayal, the Lord of Iron, master of siegecraft and design. This prison was a near-perfect imitation of the Primarch's own Cavera Ferrum, a construct of impossible geometry where its featureless walls and twisting corridors confounded all attempts at mental mapping, defying even the most disciplined of minds. Yet Vulkan, against all odds and probability, accomplished the impossible, navigating the maze with inexhaustible patience. When he reached the heart and seized Dawnbringer, where Kurz would tell him that he had disabled the teleporter beacon within the hammer, so he was trapped. But Vulkan would then remind him, it's not just a teleporter. Dawnbringer is also a hammer, to which he brought the hammer, to which he smote his brother. However, Kurz would in fact survive due to his Primarch physiology. Through his technical expertise, Vulkan reactivated the teleport Homer hidden within the hammer, transporting himself across the galaxy and reappearing across the upper atmosphere above Macragge, the homeworld of the Ultramarines, as he plummeted from a near impossible height, in which doing so caused him to be seared by atmospheric friction. Even as consciousness faded, Vulkan's mind was calm, confident in the knowing that his perpetual form would restore him, and that he would soon be in the care of his Ultramarine kin. Though the galaxy raged with betrayal and war, the Salamanders Primarch endured, despite his pathetic brother's best attempts at breaking him. Still unaware of the full horrors that had unfolded upon Isstvan V, Lord Chaplain Namus Raitan would dispatch Chaplain Lieutenant Xiphus Jur in 570-007 M31, along with a contingent of 30 fire drakes aboard the Ebon Drake. Their mission was to ascertain the fate of the Salamander's missing forces and, if possible, locate their Primarch. When the vessel arrived over the blackened sands of Isstvan V, the scene that greeted them was one of desolation. Amidst the charred trenches and crater plains, the battered shells of the Dragon Revenant lay strewn across the battlefield. Though heavily damaged and barely functional, the machine, designed and built by Vulkan, this legendary venerable dreadnought, refused to surrender to a final death. Cassian Dracos, known amongst his brothers as the Twice Dead and the Avatar of the Sacred Flames, had emerged from the blood-soaked blackened sands of Isstvan V, irrevocably altered. His survival was no simple miracle. His prolonged exposure to the planet's infernal devastation had left him with an unpredictable temperament and an unnerving ability to command the creations of the machine god and all that were bound to them. He had functionally developed technokinesis. His presence aboard the Ebon Drake reinvigorized the unbelievably demoralized crew, who now pressed their search for Vulkan with a renewed sense of determination, convinced, at least via the visual reports provided to them by the Dreadnought, that their Primarch yet lived. Later, in 007 M31, the third siege of Menza would occur, as the saga of the Shattered Legions continued as Cassian Dracos, now bearing the mantle of Cassian Vulkan, and the crew of the Ebon Drake journeyed to the beleaguered forge world of Meza, deep within Segmentum Obscurus. Here, the remnants of the Salamanders joined the planet's defenders against a coordinated assault from the 114th Grand Battalion of the Iron Warriors and the 78th chapter of the Alpha Legions, commanded by Consul Legatus Autun Sakor. With the blessings of the Norn Queens, the venerable regents of Mesa, Vorgan's dreadnought shell, forged by Vulkan himself, was sanctified as a living symbol of the machine god's favor, and the enduring spirit of the Salamanders allowed them to heavily upgrade the machine, despite it going against all restrictions of the Mechanicum's own sacred oaths. Vong struck with a precision and authority unknown to those of Chaos, confronting Narik Drangur, the Iron Warrior's commanding officer. Through displays of martial prowess and strategic acumen, Vorung revealed the betrayal of the Alpha Legion, convincing Dragar to realign his forces with the loyalists. Together they drove the Alpha Legion from Menza, preserving the Forge World and striking a small victory for the remnants of the Emperor's loyal sons. The return of Cassian Dracos marked a turning point for the Shattered Legions, as survivors of the dropsite massacres who had once teetered on the edge of despair now found a renewed sense of purpose. Though challenged by the very crucible and melting pot which was Isstvan V, Dracos' presence would prove to be a great boon, but not greater than his new technomantic abilities, aiding the Salamanders in their struggle to reclaim both their honor and the scattered remains of their shattered brotherhood. Later, in 007 M31, the charred remains of Vulkan were recovered by the Ultramarines, who initially mistook the immense corpse for a grotesque statue, a relic of a war frozen in unholy stasis. In the days that followed, however, the impossible became a reality. The Primarch's body began to regenerate, slowly at first, then with accelerating vigor. Life returned to Vulkan in full, leaving the Ultramarines' apothecaries utterly dumbfounded. Word of the phenomenon reached the ears of Reboot Guilliman, who quickly arrived at the Apothecarian only to find Vulkan in a state of mental instability, violent, incoherent, and deeply tormented. The psychological fracture stemmed from the perverse bond formed with his brother Primarch Conrad Kurz due to his immense cruelty aboard the Nightfall, compounded with surviving a nuclear explosion and then burning up, falling from orbit. Vulkan's instinctive reaction was heightened further still by the Primarch's almost psychic awareness of Kurz's presence lingering somewhere on Macragge itself. At the same time, the Dark Angel Legion had arrived in the 500 worlds of Ultramar, drawn by the empathic signals of an alien artifact known as the Ferris, a stellar beacon that mirrored the functions of the Astronomicon. Following the collapse of the Night Lord's Legion during the Thramas Crusade, Kurz had executed a desperate gamble, committing himself to a boarding action of the Dark Angel's flagship, the Invincible Reason. Though most of his warriors would perish or were captured, Kurz escaped, ultimately stealing a drop pod to descend upon Macragg's surface, spreading both terror and chaos with unremitted horror. Vulkan, breaking free of his bonds, seized Guilliman's private armory and set forth in pursuit of the Night Hunter. The two Primarchs clashed in a duel of unimaginable scale, Vulkan leveraging his newly discovered regenerative abilities to recover from injuries at an exponential rate. The duel was temporarily halted by John Grammaticus, a perpetual tasked by the shadowy Xenos coalition known as the Cabal, to eliminate Vulkan preemptively with Fuglerite, a petrified bolt of the Emperor's psychic power. Grammaticus was meant to deliver the weapon to Kurz, who would use it to strip Vulkan of his immortality. Yet before the act could be carried out, the Eldar Farseer, Eldrad Earthwain, intervened, convincing Grammaticus to wield the Fugolite himself. Striking at the heart of Vulkan, Grammaticus caused a psychic explosion that supposedly ended both their lives, neutralizing the perpetual regeneration and restoring Vulkan's mind. Following this, Vulkan's body was retrieved once again, placed it in a stasis capsule, and etched into its surface were the words Unbound Flame. Yet even this was not the conclusion of Vulkan's tale. The surviving shattered legionaries from Isstvan V would eventually be drawn by the Pharaohs to Macragge, and they would maintain a vigil over Vulkan's stasis casket. Amongst them was First Captain Atreus Numenon, who remained convinced that their Primarch yet lived. Determined to restore Vulkan fully, Numenon undertook an arduous expedition back to Nocturne, intending to immerse Vulkan's body in the purifying fire of Mount Deathfire. The journey itself was fraught with no small amount of peril, as the Salamander's vessel was pursued by a traitor fleet comprised of both Death Guard and Wordbearers forces, each with their own designs for Vulkan's body. Against impossible odds, the loyalists navigated through the turbulent ruin storm and reached Nocturne, where they met Lord Captain Nomus Rython, keeper of the keys of Prometheus, and there a desperate battle ensued between the loyalist and traitor forces, culminating in the Salamanders' victory. Once victorious, the Salamanders conducted the rites to commit Vulkan's body to the purifying flames of Mount Deathfire, awaiting the miraculous restoration of their Primarch. After a solar week, Numenon's spirit was nearly broken by the long vigil. When the next time of trials approached, he renounced his rank and wandered into the ashen-choked slopes of Mount Deathfire, offering himself as a final sacrifice for the restoration of Vulkan. True to the legend, Vulkan did regenerate once more, yet his resurgence would remain unseen to the wider Imperium until he turned back up on Terra during the last waning days of the siege, where he would use the Eldar webway to find his way to his father's side. There, he would eventually confront and, through the Emperor's blessing and aid, slay the demon prince Magnus, who would eventually return. He would also be tasked with holding the keys to a device that had the ability to completely wipe out all existence within Imperium Solar, in order to ensure that even if the traitors somehow defeated the Emperor, it would be a Pyrrhic victory at best. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, the galaxy was left in ruins, and the Salamanders' experience during this period remains at least partly shrouded in obscurity due to their numbers being reduced so much that their operational efficiency was essentially naught, leaving records fragmentary at best. And much of what is known is preserved only in the rather guarded archives of the Salamanders Librarius. What is indisputable, however, is the key role that Vulkan played during the time of rebirth, as the Imperium sought to recover and safeguard itself from further internal strife. When Rebut Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines and the Imperial Regent, authored the Codex Astartes, he intended to prevent another civil war from breaking down the Imperium by then breaking down the might of the Space Marine legions into smaller, more manageable chapters, each limited to no more than 1,000 warriors. Vulkan, alongside Leman Russ of the Space Wolves and Rogel Dorn of the Imperial Fists, initially opposed this measure. To the Primarch of the Salamanders, the Codex's restructuring risked undermining the identity and cohesion of the Legion itself, a Legion that had endured the catastrophic losses caused by the Dropsite Massacre. Yet, as with the other Primarchs, Vulkan would eventually relent, prioritizing the stability and unity of the Imperium above personal and organizational pride. The result was a compromise. The Salamanders would remain intact, the only legion explicitly exempt from division. While later foundings may have been produced through the use of the chapter's genetic legacy, there are no extensive records detailing second founding successors being directly sired from the Salamanders. Nevertheless, the similarities in physiological makeup, physical markings, and tactical doctrine of certain chapters, such as the Black Dragons and the Storm Giants, suggest the Salamander's gene seed may have been incorporated alongside traditions indirectly into the creation of other chapters. The stark truth of the exemption comes from the Salamander's immediate inability to produce successors being a consequence of the devastation they had suffered being significantly more than any of the other loyalist legions. As with each of the great settlements of Nocturne being one of the few places that they had drawn recruits from, and the battle on the planet itself devastating those as well, their existence would continue largely unchanged for a significant amount of time by the Codex's division or limitations, allowing them to be one of the legions most closely aligned with their original structure, despite adopting much of the Codex's operational stratagems as time would go on after the heresy.